Hey there, road warriors and mystery seekers. Before we dive into what is hands down the most mind-bending, reality-shattering story I've ever heard from the open road, I need you to do something for me right now. Hit that subscribe button, because what you're about to hear will make you question everything you think you know about time, space, and those lonely stretches of highway that cut through the American desert. And listen, after you hear what happened to my buddy Marcus Webb at a gas station that shouldn't exist, I want you to drop a comment telling me what state or country you're watching from, because I guarantee someone out there has driven past a place that felt wrong, that felt like it didn't belong in this timeline, and just kept going without investigating. Trust me, folks, you're going to want to stick around until the very end of this one, because the evidence Marcus found will absolutely blow your mind and change how you see every abandoned building you pass on the highway forever. My name is Hank Dawson, and I've been collecting trucker stories for over 30 years now, riding shotgun with some of the most experienced drivers this country has ever seen, hearing tales from every mile of highway between the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. I've heard stories that would make your hair stand on end, encounters that defy logic and challenge everything we think we understand about the world we live in. But nothing, and I mean absolutely nothing, prepared me for what Marcus Webb told me one freezing December night at a truck stop outside of Barstow, California. Marcus wasn't the type to believe in anything he couldn't verify with his own eyes, couldn't touch with his own hands, couldn't explain with basic logic and common sense. 19 years behind the wheel of an 18-wheeler had made him practical, skeptical, and dismissive of anything that smacked of the supernatural or the impossible. But that night, sitting across from me with a cup of coffee gone cold in his trembling hands, I watched a grown man struggle to make sense of something that had shattered his entire understanding of reality and time itself. What started as a simple fuel stop during a routine haul across the Nevada desert turned into an encounter with something that shouldn't exist, a place caught between moments, a gas station frozen in a loop of time that Marcus had somehow managed to access, and the evidence he carried in his wallet would change both of our lives forever. Marcus Webb had driven Interstate 15 through the Nevada desert more times than he could count during his 19 years as a long-haul trucker, knew every mile marker and rest stop and treacherous curve where the highway cut through ancient mountains that had stood long before humans ever dreamed of building roads through this hostile landscape. The route between Las Vegas and Los Angeles was one of the most heavily trafficked truck corridors in the western United States, a river of commerce flowing constantly between two major metropolitan areas, carrying everything from produce to electronics to the 1,000 other commodities that kept modern civilization functioning. But despite the heavy traffic during daylight hours, the nighttime desert crossing could be eerily isolated, especially during the dead hours between midnight and dawn, when even the most dedicated drivers sought rest stops to catch a few hours of sleep before continuing their journeys. It was October 12th when Marcus left Las Vegas with a load of manufactured goods destined for a warehouse in Ontario, California. A routine haul he'd made dozens of times before without incident or drama. The weather was perfect for October in the desert, cool but not cold, with clear skies that revealed more stars than most people saw in their entire lives. The Milky Way stretching across the darkness like a river of light that made the vast emptiness feel both beautiful and terrifying in its absolute indifference to human presence. Marcus had planned to drive straight through, calculating that he could reach his destination by dawn if he maintained good speed and didn't encounter any delays from accidents or construction that sometimes snarled traffic on this heavily used corridor. He'd been driving for about 3 hours when he noticed his fuel gauge dropping lower than he'd anticipated, the needle hovering dangerously close to the quarter tank mark that every experienced trucker knew was the threshold where you started looking for the next fuel stop, regardless of whether you'd planned to stop there or not. Running out of fuel on a desert highway at night wasn't just inconvenient, it was potentially dangerous, leaving you stranded in temperatures that could swing from pleasant to dangerously cold within hours, with limited cell phone coverage and the very real possibility of waiting hours for assistance to arrive from the nearest town that might be 50 or more miles away in any direction. Marcus consulted his mental map of fuel stops along this route, calculating that the next major truck stop was still about 40 miles ahead, maybe 45 minutes of driving at his current speed. His fuel gauge suggested he could make it, but barely, with almost no margin for error if he encountered unexpected traffic or had to detour for any reason. The smart move would be to stop at any available fuel station before reaching that critical point where his options disappeared and he was committed to either making it to the next stop or running out of fuel trying. He kept his eyes scanning the darkness ahead, watching for the telltale glow of station lights that would indicate civilization's presence in this vast emptiness. The highway stretched ahead like a ribbon of gray concrete, disappearing into infinite darkness, illuminated only by his headlights and the occasional reflective marker that caught his beams and threw the light back at him. The desert on both sides of the road was absolute blackness. No houses or businesses or any sign of human habitation, just emptiness that could hide anything or nothing depending on your imagination and your willingness to believe that the desert held secrets beyond what daylight revealed. Marcus wasn't superstitious, didn't believe in ghost stories or desert legends about vanishing hitchhikers or phantom vehicles that appeared and disappeared without explanation. The desert was just geology and biology adapted to extreme conditions, nothing more mysterious than that. Then he saw it, appearing so suddenly that for a moment Marcus thought he might be hallucinating from road fatigue or the hypnotic effect of staring at endless darkness, broken only by his headlights. About half a mile ahead on the right side of the highway, a gas station blazed with light, every window and pump island illuminated with a brightness that seemed almost aggressive in its intensity against the surrounding darkness. The sign above the station advertised fuel prices that made Marcus blink and look again, certain he was misreading the numbers because they were absurdly low, less than half what he'd paid in Las Vegas just 3 hours earlier. But there it was, clear as day despite the night, a fully operational gas station in a stretch of highway where Marcus could have sworn no such facility existed. Marcus felt a strange sensation in his chest, something between relief at finding fuel when he needed it and unease at encountering something unexpected in a place he thought he knew intimately. 19 years of driving the same routes created a mental map so detailed that any deviation from expected reality triggered alarm bells in his subconscious, warning him that something wasn't right, even if he couldn't immediately identify what was wrong. But fuel was fuel, and he needed it regardless of how he felt about the station's unexpected presence. He activated his turn signal and began easing his rig toward the exit, watching for any other vehicles that might be using the facility or any signs that would explain why he'd never noticed this place during his many previous trips along this route. As he pulled into the station, Marcus noticed details that reinforced his sense of unease while simultaneously seeming completely normal and mundane. The facility was immaculately clean, the concrete aprons around the fuel pumps free of the oil stains and accumulated grime that marked most truck stops after years of heavy use. The building itself looked freshly painted, its white walls gleaming under the bright lights, with large windows that revealed an interior that appeared equally pristine and well-maintained. 2 vintage fuel pumps stood on the truck side of the lot, the kind with mechanical number wheels instead of digital displays, styled in a way that Marcus associated with photographs from decades past, but maintained in perfect working condition as if they'd been installed yesterday. Marcus maneuvered his rig carefully alongside one of the vintage fuel pumps, his practiced eye assessing the station's layout and finding it oddly perfect in a way that struck him as almost theatrical. like someone had designed this place to match an idealized memory of what gas stations used to look like before corporate chains standardized everything into identical concrete boxes with identical branding and identical convenience stores selling identical products. The pump he'd chosen had a mechanical dial face showing gallons and dollars with rotating numbers visible through a glass window. Technology that had been obsolete for decades, but apparently still functional here, in this bright oasis of light, surrounded by absolute desert darkness. As Marcus set his parking brake and prepared to step down from his cab, he noticed a figure emerging from the station building, a man in his 50s or perhaps early 60s, wearing a pristine white uniform shirt and dark pants, his clothing looking like it had been pressed and starched within the hour despite the late night time. The attendant approached with a friendly smile and a wave, moving with the unhurried confidence of someone completely comfortable in their environment, showing none of the wariness that modern gas station employees typically displayed when encountering unfamiliar customers during the dangerous hours between midnight and dawn, when most crimes occurred at isolated facilities like this one. "Evening, friend," the attendant called out, his voice carrying clearly across the empty lot with an accent that Marcus couldn't quite place, something that suggested the Midwest, but with unusual pronunciations on certain words that marked him as either very old or from a region Marcus wasn't familiar with, despite his extensive travels across the country. "You're out late tonight, heading west toward California, I'd guess from the way you came in. Need a fill-up?" The man's friendliness seemed genuine, but also oddly formal, like he was following a script for how service station attendants were supposed to interact with customers, a level of courtesy that had largely disappeared from American commerce decades ago, as self-service became the norm and human interaction was minimized to save labor costs. Marcus climbed down from his cab, his boots hitting the pristine concrete with a sound that seemed too loud in the strange stillness that surrounded this bright island of civilization in the desert darkness. "Yeah, I could use a fill-up," he said, his voice sounding oddly flat to his own ears, like the air itself was absorbing sound in unnatural ways. "Didn't know there was a station here. I've driven this route dozens of times and I've never noticed this place before. Are you new, or have I just been blind all these years?" He meant it as a joke, a light comment to establish friendly rapport with the attendant. But even as he spoke the words, Marcus felt that sense of unease growing stronger, a tickle at the back of his mind that something about this entire situation was fundamentally wrong in ways he couldn't quite articulate. The attendant's smile didn't waver, but something flickered in his eyes, some emotion that Marcus couldn't identify before it was smoothed away behind professional courtesy. "We've been here a long time, friend, serving travelers on this highway since it was first paved. Sometimes people miss us in the dark, especially if they're not looking for fuel right at this spot. But we're always here when folks need us, always ready to help travelers make it to their destinations safely." The man's phrasing struck Marcus as odd, not quite wrong, but not quite right either, like he was speaking a slightly different dialect of English, where words carried subtly different connotations than Marcus was accustomed to hearing. Marcus watched as the attendant moved to his fuel tank, unlocking it with practiced ease and preparing to pump diesel, and realized with a start that full-service gas stations had been virtually extinct for decades outside of a few novelty locations in Oregon and New Jersey. "I can pump it myself if that's easier," Marcus offered, feeling awkward about having someone else perform a task he'd done thousands of times himself. The attendant waved off his offer with a smile. "No trouble at all, friend. That's what I'm here for, to make sure travelers like yourself get back on the road quickly and safely. You just relax, maybe stretch your legs, or use the facilities if you need to. I'll have you filled up in no time." The fuel pumped with a rhythmic clicking sound as the mechanical dials spun, counting off gallons with visible numbers rotating behind glass, a sight that triggered something in Marcus's memory, some half-forgotten childhood recollection of riding with his grandfather to gas stations that looked like this, that operated like this, before everything became digital and impersonal and automated. The price counter spun too, and Marcus watched the numbers with growing disbelief because the cost per gallon was showing as 79 cents, a price that hadn't existed since his grandfather's generation, since decades before Marcus himself had been born. "Your prices are wrong on the pump," Marcus said, pointing to the spinning numbers. "That can't be the real cost per gallon." The attendant glanced at the pump and shrugged, his expression showing no concern or confusion at Marcus's observation. "Those are our prices, friend, same as they've always been. We try to keep costs down for travelers, especially truckers like yourself who are working hard to keep goods moving across the country. Can't have you going broke just trying to do your job now, can we?" His logic made sense in the abstract, but the reality of fuel prices being frozen at levels from 6 decades ago made no economic sense whatsoever, violated every principle of inflation and market economics that governed the modern world. Marcus felt his unease deepening into something closer to alarm, but he couldn't identify any specific threat or danger, just this pervasive sense that he'd driven into a situation that defied rational explanation. While the fuel pumped, Marcus decided to use the restroom facilities inside the station, partly because he actually needed to, and partly because he wanted to see more of this impossible place, to gather more details that might help him understand what was happening here. He walked toward the building, his boots loud on the concrete, and pushed through a glass door that swung smoothly on well-oiled hinges without the squeak or resistance that characterized most old doors. The interior of the station was as pristine as the exterior, with polished linoleum floors that gleamed under fluorescent lights, walls painted in cheerful colors that reminded Marcus of photographs from the 1950s or 60s, and merchandise displays featuring products he didn't recognize, brands that looked vaguely familiar but with packaging designs that seemed decades out of date. A radio played softly from somewhere behind the counter, music that Marcus recognized as being from the early 1960s, songs his grandmother used to play when he was a child, melodies and harmonies that belonged to a different era of American culture. The bathroom, when he found it, was impeccably clean, with fixtures that were old-fashioned but perfectly maintained, tiles without a single crack or stain, mirrors that reflected his face with perfect clarity. Marcus stood at the sink washing his hands and staring at his own reflection, trying to reconcile the impossible situation he found himself in with his need for logical explanations that would make sense of sensory input that seemed to defy the basic rules of reality and time. When Marcus emerged from the restroom, he found the attendant waiting inside behind an old-fashioned cash register, the kind with mechanical keys and a bell that dinged when the cash drawer opened, technology that belonged in museums rather than operational businesses. The man smiled warmly as Marcus approached, pulling out a handwritten receipt pad and beginning to total up the fuel purchase with a pen, actually writing out numbers by hand instead of letting a computer calculate everything automatically. "That'll be $42.17 for your diesel, friend," the attendant said cheerfully, tearing the handwritten receipt from the pad with a practiced motion that suggested he'd performed this action thousands of times. "Will that be cash or charge today?" Marcus stared at the total, his mind struggling to process fuel prices that would have been reasonable in 1963, but were impossible in the present day, representing costs roughly 15 times lower than what he'd paid in Las Vegas just hours earlier. He had perhaps $200 in cash in his wallet, money he kept for emergencies when credit cards might not work or be accepted, and the absurdly low price meant he could easily pay cash for fuel that should have cost him well over $600 at normal rates. Part of his mind screamed that he should question this, should demand explanations, should refuse to participate in whatever impossible situation he'd stumbled into. But another part, the practical trucker part that had learned to accept unexpected good fortune without looking too closely at its origins, simply reached for his wallet. "I'll pay cash," Marcus heard himself say, his voice sounding distant to his own ears as he counted out bills and handed them to the attendant. who accepted them with a smile and made change from the old-fashioned register with its mechanical bell and divided cash drawer. The bills the attendant returned as change looked slightly off to Marcus's eye. The colors not quite right, the paper texture subtly different from modern currency, but he pocketed them without comment, his rational mind insisting that he was just tired, that road fatigue was making him see irregularities that weren't really there. The attendant handed him the handwritten receipt with a smile, wishing him safe travels and good fortune on the remainder of his journey west toward California and whatever destinations waited there. Marcus accepted the receipt and stuffed it into his wallet without looking at it closely, his mind already focused on getting back on the road and putting distance between himself and this unsettling place that triggered every alarm bell in his subconscious. Despite presenting no obvious threat or danger, he walked quickly back to his truck, resisting the urge to run, maintaining the professional demeanor of an experienced driver who had seen everything and wasn't frightened by a merely unusual gas station. The attendant followed him outside and waved cheerfully as Marcus climbed into his cab, calling out another wish for safe travels that sounded sincere, despite the strangeness of everything else about this encounter. Marcus started his engine with relief at the familiar sounds and vibrations of his rig coming to life, the normal mechanical responses that grounded him in reality and pushed back against the dreamlike quality that had characterized his entire stop at this impossible gas station. He pulled away from the fuel pumps carefully, checking his mirrors out of habit, and drove toward the exit that would return him to the highway and the continuation of his journey westward. In his mirrors, he could see the attendant still waving, still smiling, standing in that pool of brilliant light that seemed too bright, too clean, too perfect to belong to any real business operating in the modern world. As Marcus merged back onto Interstate 15 and accelerated to highway speed, he glanced in his mirrors one last time at the gas station receding behind him, that bright oasis of light growing smaller and smaller, until it was just another glow in the vast darkness of the Nevada desert. Within minutes, it had disappeared completely, swallowed by distance and darkness, leaving Marcus alone with his thoughts and his questions and his growing certainty that something impossible had just occurred, something that violated the fundamental rules of how reality worked. But his fuel gauge showed full, his receipt proved he'd actually stopped and purchased fuel, and he had nowhere to be except his destination in California. So he pushed his questions aside and focused on driving. The remainder of his journey to Ontario passed without incident, the highway rolling beneath his wheels in the familiar rhythm that had defined his adult life, the gradual appearance of civilization as he approached the Los Angeles metropolitan area, providing reassurance that the world operated according to normal rules and expected patterns. He delivered his load on schedule, got his paperwork signed, and immediately received instructions to pick up a return load in San Bernardino that needed to go back to Las Vegas. A quick turnaround that would have him returning along the same route within 12 hours of having traveled it in the opposite direction. Marcus felt a complex mix of anticipation and dread at the prospect of driving past that gas station again, wanting to see it in daylight, wanting to confirm that it actually existed and wasn't some hallucination born of road fatigue and isolation. He grabbed a few hours of sleep in his cab before picking up the return load, enough rest to clear his head and restore his energy, but not enough to erase the memory of that strange encounter or diminish his curiosity about what he would find when he drove past that location again during daylight hours. The sun was approaching its zenith when Marcus headed east on Interstate 15, the desert landscape revealed in all its harsh beauty under the unforgiving light that turned sand and rock into a palette of browns and reds and subtle purples where shadows gathered in draws and canyons. He watched his odometer and calculated distance, trying to estimate exactly where that gas station should appear, based on his memory of the previous night's drive and the landmarks he could recognize in daylight. Marcus's anticipation built as he approached what he calculated to be the approximate location of the gas station, his eyes scanning the right side of the highway for that familiar cluster of buildings and fuel pumps that should be clearly visible in the bright midday sun. The desert stretched away on both sides of the road, empty and ancient, dotted with sagebrush and Joshua trees that marked this landscape as distinctively Mojave, distinctively hostile to human habitation, except along corridors like this highway, where infrastructure imposed civilization's will on nature's indifference. He passed several abandoned structures, the skeletal remains of failed businesses that had tried to serve travelers and lost their gamble against the desert's harshness. Buildings reduced to foundations and fragments that told stories of hope and defeat in equal measure. Then he saw it, or rather he saw what should have been it, and his blood ran cold despite the desert heat that baked the world outside his air-conditioned cab. On the right side of the highway, exactly where his memory insisted the gas station had stood just 12 hours earlier, there was nothing but an empty lot marked by a rusted chain-link fence leaning at crazy angles, surrounding a rectangle of bare earth where something had clearly stood decades ago but had long since been demolished or collapsed into rubble that had been cleared away. Marcus felt his heart rate accelerate, felt sweat break out on his forehead despite the cool air blowing from his vents, felt the world tilt slightly as his rational mind struggled to process sensory input that made no sense whatsoever. He hit his turn signal and pulled onto the shoulder, his training and experience guiding his hands through the familiar motions, even while his conscious mind reeled with confusion and growing fear at implications he didn't want to examine too closely. Marcus sat for a moment after setting his parking brake, hands gripping the wheel, staring at that empty lot, and trying to convince himself that he'd miscalculated the distance, that the gas station must be further east or further west, that his memory of landmarks was faulty, and he was simply looking at the wrong location. But the landscape around the lot matched his memory perfectly. The distinctive rock formation visible to the north, the curve of the highway, the exact configuration of desert features that his trained eye had automatically catalogued during his stop 12 hours earlier. Marcus climbed down from his cab and walked across the shoulder toward the rusted fence, his boots crunching on gravel and broken glass, the desert heat hitting him like a physical force after the air-conditioned comfort of his truck. Up close, the lot revealed more details that only deepened the mystery, confirmed that whatever had stood here had been gone for a very long time, not merely 12 hours. The concrete foundation was cracked and broken, weeds growing through gaps that spoke of decades of neglect. The chain-link fence so corroded that sections crumbled when Marcus touched them experimentally, orange rust coating his fingers with powder that had the texture of fine sand. He walked around the perimeter of the lot, his trained eye cataloging details and trying to build a mental picture of what structure might have stood here based on the foundation remnants he could see through the weeds and accumulated sand that had blown in during countless desert windstorms. The shape was right, approximately right anyway. The footprint that would match a small gas station with a service building and room for 2 or perhaps 3 fuel pump islands. Marcus found himself looking for the pumps themselves, for any remnant of the vintage mechanical pumps he'd used just hours earlier. But there was nothing, just bare earth and broken concrete, and the absolute silence of the desert, broken only by the sound of traffic passing on the highway behind him. His hands were shaking as he reached for his wallet, pulling it out with fingers that felt clumsy and disconnected from his brain, fumbling the leather open and searching for the receipt that would prove he hadn't imagined the entire encounter, that would anchor his memory to physical reality and push back against the impossible conclusion his mind kept trying to force him toward. The receipt was there, folded between 2 $20 bills in the cash compartment, the paper slightly yellowed and brittle to his touch in a way that currency and documents shouldn't be after just 12 hours in his wallet. Marcus unfolded it carefully, afraid it might crumble like the rusted fence he'd touched moments earlier. The receipt was handwritten in blue ink that had faded to pale purple, the numbers recording his fuel purchase clearly legible, but rendered in handwriting that looked antique somehow, like something from an era before modern education standardized how people formed letters and numbers. Marcus's eyes skipped over the fuel quantities and prices, focusing instead on the date printed at the top of the receipt in a mechanical date stamp, the kind that used rubber letters and had to be manually updated each day by changing individual date wheels. His vision swam as his brain processed what his eyes were seeing, rejected it, processed it again, rejected it again, cycling through denial and acceptance in rapid waves that made him feel dizzy and nauseous. The date on the receipt read October 12th, 1963, not October 12th, 2025, which would be today's date, not October 12th, 2024, which would suggest he'd somehow kept an old receipt without realizing it. October 12th, 1963, exactly 62 years ago to the day, a date from before Marcus's parents had been born, from before interstate highways had been completed across the American West, from an era that existed only in history books and old photographs and the fading memories of elderly people who had lived through those times. Marcus stared at the impossible date, his mind cycling through explanations and rejecting each one as insufficient or insane, until he was left with no explanations at all, just the receipt in his trembling hands and the empty lot stretching before him. He stood there for a long time, the desert sun beating down on him, sweat soaking through his shirt, his mind refusing to function properly as it tried to process an experience that violated every rule of physical reality he'd ever learned or accepted. The receipt was real. He could touch it and feel its texture and see the ink that had been applied by a human hand decades before he'd been born. The fuel in his tank was real. He could see the gauge showing full and feel the weight of his rig increased by the hundreds of gallons of diesel he'd purchased at impossible prices from an impossible station. But the station itself was gone, had been gone for decades based on the condition of the foundation and fence, had never existed in any timeline that made rational sense. Marcus returned to his truck in a daze, his mind still cycling through impossible scenarios and finding no purchase on any explanation that satisfied both his need for rational understanding and the physical evidence he held in his hand. He sat in his cab for several minutes, staring at the receipt and the empty lot visible through his windshield, trying to decide what to do next, what steps a rational person should take when confronted with evidence of the impossible. Finally, he pulled out his phone and did what people always do when seeking answers in the modern world. He started searching the internet for information about gas stations along this stretch of Interstate 15, looking for historical records that might explain what he'd experienced. The search results came slowly over the spotty cell connection that was all the desert offered to travelers, pages loading in fragments that Marcus read with growing fascination and horror as pieces of a larger puzzle began falling into place. There had been a gas station at this location exactly where he'd stopped, serving travelers on what had been US Route 91 before Interstate 15 replaced it in the late 1960s. The station had been owned and operated by a man named Harold Mitchell, and his family had developed a reputation for excellent service and fair prices, had been a welcome oasis for travelers crossing the desert between Las Vegas and Los Angeles during the era before air conditioning, and reliable vehicles made desert travel merely routine rather than genuinely dangerous. Marcus scrolled through archived newspaper articles and local history websites, his hands still shaking slightly as he pieced together the story of Harold Mitchell's gas station and what had happened to end its operation decades ago. The details emerged from digitized microfilm and historical society records, painting a picture of a business that had thrived through the 1950s and into the early 60s, serving the growing traffic of Americans taking to the newly built interstate highway system, participating in the great democratization of travel that transformed American culture during the post-war boom years. Harold Mitchell had been known as a kind and generous man, his station as a place where stranded travelers could count on help even if they couldn't afford to pay immediately. Then Marcus found the article that made his blood run cold. A short piece from a Las Vegas newspaper dated October 14th, 1963, describing a tragic fire that had destroyed the Mitchell family gas station and killed Harold Mitchell, his wife Sarah, and their 2 teenage children who had been sleeping in the attached living quarters when flames broke out in the early morning hours of October 12th. The fire had started in the garage area, possibly from a cigarette or electrical malfunction, had spread quickly through the wooden structure and had consumed the building before fire trucks could arrive from the nearest town over 30 miles away. The family had died from smoke inhalation before the flames reached them, a small mercy in an otherwise devastating tragedy. Marcus sat in his truck reading and rereading the article, his mind making connections that seemed impossible but were supported by the evidence in his hand and the empty lot outside his window. The fire had occurred on October 12, 1963, the same date printed on his receipt. He had stopped at the station during the night of October 12th, exactly 62 years later to the day, had been served by a friendly attendant who matched newspaper descriptions of Harold Mitchell, had purchased fuel at prices that made sense only in the context of 1963 economics. Somehow, impossibly, Marcus had driven into a moment in time that no longer existed, had interacted with a place and person that had been dead for over 6 decades, had crossed some boundary between present and past that shouldn't be permeable to physical beings and machines. He continued researching, driven by a desperate need to understand what had happened to him, to find some framework that would make sense of an experience that defied everything he knew about how reality worked. Marcus discovered references to temporal anomalies reported by other travelers along this stretch of highway, stories that had been dismissed as legends or hallucinations, or the products of exhaustion and isolation and the desert's ability to play tricks on human perception. Multiple drivers had reported encountering gas stations or diners or other businesses that subsequently couldn't be found, that disappeared upon second visits, that left no trace except for memories and occasionally physical evidence that defied rational explanation. One theory that Marcus found particularly compelling suggested that places where traumatic events occurred could create impressions in the fabric of space-time, echoes or recordings that occasionally became accessible to people passing through during specific conditions or alignments. The Mitchell family's death by fire had certainly been traumatic enough to potentially create such an impression. 4 lives ended suddenly in a place they'd considered safe, consciousness snuffed out while they slept and dreamed of futures that would never arrive. Perhaps the station repeated eternally the last normal day before the fire, October 12th, 1963, when everything was still right with their world, when Harold Mitchell still served travelers and took pride in his business and looked forward to growing old with his family around him. Another theory focused on the nature of the desert itself, suggesting that these ancient landscapes, with their extreme conditions and long geological timescales, existed in a different relationship to time than places where human activity had dominated for generations. The desert was patient, unmoved by human concerns, operating on rhythms measured in millennia rather than years or days or hours. Perhaps in such places, the boundaries between different moments became thinner, more permeable, allowing travelers under the right circumstances to slip between timelines, like sliding between rooms through a door that usually remained locked. Marcus wanted to dismiss these theories as pseudo-scientific nonsense, but he couldn't deny the evidence in his wallet and his memory. As the afternoon sun began its descent toward the western horizon, Marcus finally started his truck and pulled back onto the highway, continuing his journey toward Las Vegas, with his mind churning through questions that had no satisfactory answers. He couldn't shake the image of Harold Mitchell smiling and waving as Marcus drove away, the man completely unaware that within hours his life and his family's lives would end in fire and smoke, that his beloved gas station would be reduced to ashes and eventually demolished until nothing remained but a bare foundation and rusted fence. Had Marcus actually traveled back to that moment, or had he interacted with some echo or recording of it? Had Harold Mitchell been truly alive during their interaction, or was he already dead? Just a ghost going through the motions of service he'd performed countless times during his life. Marcus couldn't let it go, couldn't return to his normal routine of hauling loads and logging miles, and treating the highways as mere transportation infrastructure instead of potential gateways to impossible experiences. He found himself making excuses to drive Interstate 15 through that particular stretch of Nevada desert, volunteering for runs that took him between Las Vegas and California, timing his trips to pass the former location of Mitchell's gas station at different hours of the day and night, hoping to encounter the anomaly again, to confirm that his first experience hadn't been a one-time hallucination or fluke or cosmic accident that could never be repeated. His dispatcher noticed the pattern and asked if Marcus had developed a preference for that route, and Marcus fabricated explanations about scenic beauty and reliable truck stops that sounded thin even to his own ears. During his multiple passes through that area, Marcus stopped at the empty lot every time, walking the perimeter and examining the foundation for any clues he might have missed during his first shocked investigation. He took photographs of the site, measured distances, documented the positions of remaining structural elements, building a detailed map of what had once stood there and comparing it to his memories of the functioning station he'd visited. The footprint matched, the layout aligned with his recollections, providing physical confirmation that he hadn't simply invented the entire experience from exhaustion or stress or some psychological break from the grinding isolation of long-haul trucking. He researched Harold Mitchell's life in exhaustive detail, combing through genealogical records and old newspapers and archived photographs, building a picture of the man who had lived and died at that desert gas station over 6 decades ago. Harold had been born in Oklahoma during the Great Depression, had served in the Pacific during World War II, had returned home and married his sweetheart Sarah after the war ended, had moved west to Nevada, seeking opportunity in the boom years that followed victory. He'd opened his gas station in 1952, had built it into a successful business through hard work and fair dealing, had raised 2 children who helped around the station and attended school in the nearest town, had seemed to be living the American dream until fire consumed everything on one October night. Marcus found photographs of the Mitchell family, images preserved in historical society archives, and newspaper articles about local businesses serving highway travelers. Harold looked exactly as Marcus remembered him. The same friendly face and warm smile, the same confident posture of a man comfortable with his place in the world. Seeing those photographs hit Marcus like a physical blow, confirmation that he had truly interacted with someone who had been dead since 1963, that he had stood face to face with a ghost or a time echo or whatever label could be applied to something that existed impossibly between moments. The photographs also showed Sarah Mitchell and the 2 children, faces that Marcus hadn't seen during his stop but felt compelled to memorize now, as if learning their features would honor their memory or help him understand the mystery he'd become part of. He tried to share his experience with other truckers, carefully describing what had happened without mentioning the impossible aspects at first, testing whether anyone else had encountered similar phenomena in the same location. The reactions varied from skeptical dismissal to nervous laughter to a few quiet admissions that the desert played tricks on everyone eventually, that isolation and fatigue could make people see things that weren't really there or remember events differently than they'd actually occurred. But a few drivers, usually older ones with decades of experience on these routes, would get a distant look in their eyes and admit to encounters they couldn't explain, businesses that appeared and vanished, vehicles that shouldn't exist, still driving highways they'd left decades ago, Conversations with people who seemed slightly wrong in ways that became obvious only in retrospect. Marcus became fascinated with temporal anomalies more broadly, reading everything he could find about time slips and chronological displacements, and reports from around the world of people who claimed to have temporarily accessed different eras before returning to their proper timeline. The phenomenon had been reported throughout history, with accounts ranging from medieval monks who claimed to have witnessed future events during visions, to modern travelers who insisted they'd briefly visited past decades while driving or walking through certain locations. Most reports were dismissed as misperceptions or hoaxes or symptoms of mental illness, but the sheer volume of similar accounts across different cultures and time periods suggested that perhaps something genuine was occurring, even if it didn't fit conventional understanding of how time worked. He discovered that October seemed to be significant in many temporal anomaly reports. Something about the transition between seasons, or the position of Earth in its orbit, or purely coincidental patterns that human brains were programmed to see, even in random data. Marcus's experience had occurred on October 12th, exactly 62 years after the fire that killed the Mitchell family, an anniversary that might have some significance for creating conditions where past and present could briefly overlap. He began planning to be at that location on October 12th the following year, gambling that whatever had allowed him to access 1963 might recur on the anniversary, might follow predictable patterns that could be studied and anticipated if someone was dedicated enough to try. His obsession began affecting his work performance, Marcus arriving late to pickups because he detoured to investigate other allegedly haunted or anomalous locations along his routes, spending money he couldn't really afford on books and conferences about paranormal phenomena and temporal physics, alienating friends and family who didn't understand his fixation on an experience they assumed was either a dream or a breakdown. His dispatcher issued warnings about reliability, threatened to reassign his regular routes to more dependable drivers, and Marcus realized he was risking the career he'd built over 19 years of dedicated service. But he couldn't stop. Couldn't return to seeing highways as mere pavement instead of potential doorways to impossible places. Couldn't forget Harold Mitchell's friendly smile or the weight of that impossible receipt in his wallet. The following October 12th found Marcus parked on the shoulder beside the empty lot where Mitchell's gas station had stood, his truck positioned exactly where he'd been on the night of his original encounter, waiting as the sun set and darkness spread across the desert like ink dissolving in water. He'd arranged his schedule to be in this exact location at this exact time, had told his dispatcher he needed personal time and would be unreachable for several hours, had committed fully to attempting to recreate the conditions that had allowed him to access 1963, exactly 1 year earlier. His fuel tank was deliberately run down to near empty, matching his state during the original encounter, his mental state hovering between desperate hope and fear that he was losing his mind entirely. As darkness fell completely and stars emerged in the clear desert sky, Marcus sat behind his wheel and watched the empty lot, waiting for lights to appear, for buildings to materialize from nothing, for the impossible to occur again and validate his entire year of obsessive research and planning. Hours passed, marked by the slow rotation of stars overhead and the occasional passage of other vehicles whose headlights briefly illuminated the barren landscape before fading back into darkness. Nothing changed. No gas station appeared. No friendly attendant emerged to offer service, just the empty lot and the rusted fence, and Marcus's growing despair as he realized that perhaps his original experience had been unique, unrepeatable, a one-time glitch in reality that would never occur again, regardless of how much he wanted it to. He tried everything he could think of to trigger the phenomenon. driving away and approaching from different angles, stopping at precisely calculated times based on his best estimate of when he'd arrived the previous year, even getting out and walking around the lot, speaking aloud to Harold Mitchell as if the man's ghost might hear and respond. The desert remained stubbornly normal, refusing to cooperate with Marcus's desperate need for answers and confirmation. As midnight passed and October 13th began, Marcus finally accepted that whatever had happened the previous year wasn't recurring, at least not in any way he could detect or access through his clumsy attempts to manipulate conditions he didn't understand. Defeated and exhausted, Marcus started his truck and prepared to leave, accept his failure, return to his normal life, and try to make peace with an experience he would never fully understand or be able to replicate. But as he checked his mirrors before pulling onto the highway, something caught his attention, a flicker of light in his side mirror that didn't match the darkness he'd been staring at for hours. Marcus froze, his hand on the gear shift, his eyes locked on the mirror and what it was showing him. Behind his truck, impossible but visible in the reflected image, lights were beginning to glow where the empty lot had been, faint at first, but growing brighter, outlining the shape of a building that didn't exist in the darkness outside his windows. Heart-pounding, Marcus slowly turned his head to look directly at the lot through his driver's side window, but there was nothing there, just darkness and the faint outline of the rusted fence visible in his truck's running lights. The mirror, however, continued to show something different, continued to display an illuminated gas station, exactly as Marcus remembered it from a year ago, complete with vintage pumps and pristine white buildings, and that too bright quality that seemed to push back against the surrounding darkness with unnatural force. Marcus realized he was seeing two different versions of reality simultaneously, one in direct observation and another in reflection, as if the mirror was somehow tuned to a different frequency or wavelength of existence that his naked eyes couldn't detect. Moving carefully, afraid that sudden motion might break whatever fragile connection had been established, Marcus adjusted his mirror to get a better view of what it was showing him. The gas station appeared fully formed now, and Marcus could see a figure moving around inside the lit building, could make out the shape of the vintage fuel pumps, could even see what appeared to be a 1950s-era automobile parked at one of the pump islands. Details that confirmed this was more than just reflected light playing tricks, but rather a genuine window into a different moment in time. He grabbed his phone and tried to photograph what the mirror was showing, but the camera screen displayed only darkness and the empty lot, unable or unwilling to capture whatever his mirror was reflecting from some other dimension or timeline. Marcus sat paralyzed with indecision, torn between his desperate desire to interact with the anomaly again and his growing fear that he was experiencing some kind of psychotic break from reality, that the mirror was showing him nothing but his own desperate hallucinations projected onto glass. But the reflection remained stable, didn't waver or shift like he would expect a hallucination to do, showed consistent details that his conscious mind had no reason to invent. The attendant, Harold Mitchell, if Marcus's identification was correct, emerged from the building and stood under the station lights, looking around as if sensing something unusual, even though Marcus's truck remained invisible to him, existing in different moments separated by decades, but sharing the same physical location. On impulse, Marcus couldn't later explain, he flashed his headlights twice, sending beams of light across the empty lot that in his direct vision illuminated nothing but bare earth and broken concrete. In the mirror, however, something remarkable happened. Harold Mitchell turned and looked directly toward where Marcus's truck sat, his expression shifting from casual alertness to confusion, and then to something that might have been recognition or understanding. The man raised his hand in a slow wave, acknowledging Marcus's presence, even though they existed in different timelines, separated by 62 years of linear time, but sharing this location at the intersection of past and present. Marcus waved back, his hand moving through air that existed in 2025, while its reflection traversed space that existed in 1963. Harold Mitchell moved toward where Marcus's truck sat in its own timeline, walking across the space that showed as empty lot in direct vision, but appeared as pristine station grounds in mirror reflection, his form growing larger and more detailed as he approached the temporal boundary between past and present. Marcus watched in fascination mixed with growing unease as the man stopped roughly where the station property would have ended, where the edge of his reality apparently met the barrier separating it from Marcus's timeline. Harold's mouth moved as if speaking, but Marcus heard nothing, their audio connection apparently blocked by whatever laws governed the partial permeability of this temporal anomaly. Frustrated by the inability to communicate through sound, Marcus grabbed a notebook and marker he kept in his cab for trip documentation, writing in large letters, "Can you see me?" He held the notebook up toward his driver's side window, positioning it where he thought Harold might be able to see it in whatever reverse or inverted way their visual connection worked between timeline. In the mirror, Marcus watched Harold squint at the notebook, his expression shifting through confusion to concentration as he apparently processed the message. The man nodded vigorously and pointed to Marcus's truck, confirming that some form of visual connection existed between their separated moments, even if the mechanism remained mysterious. Marcus wrote another message. "What year is it for you?" Harold's response came through gesture, the man holding up fingers to indicate numbers. 1963, confirming what Marcus had already believed but needed verified, that he was somehow observing and interacting with a moment that had occurred over 6 decades ago. The confirmation sent chills down Marcus's spine, despite the warm desert night, the absolute proof that time wasn't the rigid, forward-flowing river he'd always assumed, but rather something more complex and mutable, capable of loops and eddies, and strange connections between moments that should have been permanently separated. If this was real, if he wasn't experiencing an elaborate hallucination, then everything he thought he understood about reality required radical revision. Harold pulled out what looked like a pad of paper from his uniform pocket, the same pad he'd used to write Marcus's receipt during the previous year's encounter, and began writing something in large letters that he then held up toward where he apparently perceived Marcus's presence. The message took Marcus several moments to decipher in the mirror's reflection, his brain having to mentally flip the reversed letters until they made sense. "Danger tonight, fire coming, can't stop it." The words hit Marcus like a physical blow, confirmation that Harold somehow understood what was about to happen to him and his family, knew that death was approaching in flames and smoke, yet apparently felt powerless to prevent the tragedy despite having been warned by whatever mechanism had created this impossible connection. Marcus's hands shook as he wrote his response. "Get your family out. Leave now. Fire will kill you all tonight." He held the message up desperately, hoping that providing explicit warning would change something, would give Harold the information or motivation needed to escape the fate that had claimed him in the original timeline. But Harold's reflected image shook his head slowly, his expression sad but resigned, and he wrote another message. "Can't change it. Already tried. Everything fixed." This is the loop. Marcus felt his heart breaking for this man who apparently understood he was trapped in a temporal prison, doomed to relive the last normal hours before his death over and over, aware of his approaching end, but unable to take any action that would alter the outcome. The implications were staggering and terrifying in equal measure. If Harold's situation was truly fixed, if he couldn't escape or change his fate despite being aware of it, then what did that mean for free will and choice and the possibility of altering any outcomes through human action? Was everything predetermined? Were all choices illusory? Did the future exist as solidly as the past, with humans merely experiencing the illusion of moving through time, while actually being static figures in a 4-dimensional sculpture that encompassed all moments simultaneously? Marcus's mind recoiled from these philosophical abysses, from implications that made human agency meaningless and reduced all struggles to futile gestures against immovable destiny. Harold wrote another message, his handwriting shaky as if the effort of maintaining this connection across decades was draining. Tell them I tried. Sarah and the kids. Tell them I knew and tried to save them. Marcus felt tears burning at the corners of his eyes. Grief for a man trapped in eternal repetition of his final hours, aware of his approaching doom but powerless to prevent it, doomed to watch his family die over and over while attempting futilely to alter an outcome that remained fixed regardless of his knowledge or efforts. Marcus nodded vigorously and wrote, I promise, I'll find them, I'll tell them. Even though Sarah and the children had died 62 years ago, even though their graves had long since been visited by descendants Marcus could potentially locate, he would keep this promise to a ghost who needed someone to bear witness to his struggle. The connection began to fade, the lights of the station in Marcus's mirror dimming and flickering like a signal losing strength. Harold's reflected image becoming translucent and wavering like heat shimmer on summer pavement. The man raised his hand in farewell, his expression mixing sadness with what might have been gratitude that someone had seen him, had communicated with him, had acknowledged his existence in this temporal prison where he remained trapped between moments. Marcus raised his own hand in response, maintaining the gesture even as Harold faded completely, and the mirror showed only darkness, and the empty lot and Marcus's own face reflected back at him with tears streaming down his cheeks. Marcus sat in his truck for a long time after the vision ended, processing what he'd witnessed and the promise he'd made to a man who had been dead since 1963. The philosophical implications could wait. The questions about determinism versus free will could be examined later when he had emotional space to grapple with such abstractions. Right now, Marcus had a mission, a sacred duty to locate the descendants of Sarah Mitchell and her children, to deliver Harold's message that he had known about the fire and had tried desperately to change the outcome, even though fate or physics or whatever governed temporal loops had prevented him from saving his family. It was the least Marcus could do for someone trapped in eternal repetition of their worst day. Marcus's research into the Mitchell family's descendants consumed his free time over the following weeks, turning his truck's cab into a mobile research center filled with printed genealogical records, newspaper archives, and social media searches designed to track down anyone who might be related to Harold and Sarah Mitchell. The couple had died without their children producing any offspring, but both Harold and Sarah had siblings whose descendants might still be alive and locatable. Marcus felt driven by his promise, by the weight of Harold's desperate message, asking that his family be told he'd tried to save them even though he'd failed, by the need to give meaning to his bizarre encounters with a temporal anomaly that had shattered his understanding of reality. He eventually located Margaret Sullivan, a woman in her 70s living in Henderson, Nevada, who turned out to be the daughter of Sarah Mitchell's younger sister. Margaret had never known her aunt personally since Sarah had died years before Margaret's birth, but she'd grown up hearing family stories about the tragic fire that killed Sarah, Harold, and their 2 teenage children on that October night in 1963. When Marcus called her and explained that he had information about the fire, information that might bring some closure or understanding to a tragedy that had haunted her family for generations, Margaret agreed to meet him at a coffee shop in Henderson during his next run through the Las Vegas area. The meeting was awkward at first, Marcus struggling to explain how he'd come by information about events that had occurred decades before his birth without revealing the impossible nature of his encounters with Harold's ghost, or temporal echo, or whatever label applied to consciousness trapped in a loop. He started by showing Margaret the receipt, the physical evidence that he'd somehow accessed 1963, letting her examine the handwritten fuel charges and the date stamp that couldn't be faked or explained through any rational means. Margaret held the yellowed paper with trembling hands, her eyes fixed on the date and the handwriting that she said looked exactly like samples she'd seen in family documents. Harold's distinctive way of forming numbers that marked this as genuinely his work. Marcus then described his encounters in carefully chosen language, presenting them as dreams or visions rather than claiming actual time travel, giving Margaret space to interpret his experiences through whatever framework made sense to her own beliefs and understanding. He told her about Harold's message, about the man's desperate insistence that he'd known about the fire and had tried to prevent it, about his need for his family to understand that he hadn't simply died unaware, but had struggled against fate, even though he'd ultimately failed. Margaret listened with tears streaming down her face, her hands clutching the receipt like a lifeline, connecting her to relatives she'd never known, but whose tragedy had shaped her family's history across 3 generations. My grandmother, Sarah's sister, never got over losing her, Margaret said quietly, her voice thick with emotion as she processed Marcus's story. She used to say that Sarah appeared to her sometimes in dreams, trying to communicate something, but never quite succeeding in making herself understood. The fire was ruled accidental, an electrical fault or careless cigarette or something that nobody could have predicted or prevented. But Grandma always insisted that something felt wrong about it, that there were details that didn't quite make sense, that maybe it wasn't as simple as the official report suggested. She died still believing that the truth about that night had never been fully revealed or understood. Marcus shared everything he'd learned through his research about the fire itself, details from newspaper accounts and fire marshal reports that had been digitized and made available through historical archives. The fire had started around 3 in the morning on October 13th, technically, though Harold's last living moments would have been late on October 12th, during the hours when Marcus had stopped for fuel. The origin point had been traced to the garage area, where Harold did mechanical work on customer vehicles, but investigators had never determined with certainty what had sparked the initial flames. No accelerants had been detected, no evidence of arson or foul play, just a fire that had started in a building full of flammable materials and had spread with devastating speed through the wooden structure where a family slept. What if Harold knew it was coming because he'd seen it before? Marcus suggested carefully, testing whether Margaret would accept the implications of temporal loops and repeated timelines. What if that night wasn't the first time he'd lived through October 12th? What if he'd been trapped in some kind of cycle where he experienced the same events over and over, gaining knowledge of what was coming but finding himself unable to change the outcome no matter how hard he tried? That would explain why he seemed so resigned in my vision, why he said everything was fixed and couldn't be altered. He'd already tried every possible variation, attempted every way to prevent the fire or get his family out, and discovered that fate, or physics, or whatever governs these things, wouldn't allow deviations from the established timeline. Margaret considered this possibility for a long moment, her expression showing the struggle between rational skepticism and emotional need to believe that her aunt's husband had fought to save his family rather than dying passively. "I want to believe that's true," she finally said. "I want to believe that Harold wasn't just an innocent victim, but someone who struggled against impossible odds to protect the people he loved, even if he ultimately failed. It gives meaning to the tragedy, transforms it from random misfortune into something more profound, a story about the limits of human agency and the terrible weight of knowledge that can't be acted upon effectively. If what you're telling me is real, if Harold really did communicate with you across 62 years of separation, then he deserves to be remembered not just as a victim, but as someone who fought until the very end." Marcus gave Margaret copies of all his research, the photographs of the gas station from its operating years, the newspaper articles about the fire, the genealogical records he'd compiled while tracking down descendants, everything that might help her family understand the full context of what had happened that October night. He also promised to keep the original receipt, to preserve it as evidence of his encounters and as a physical link to a moment that shouldn't be accessible, but somehow was, for reasons neither of them could fully explain. Margaret hugged him when they parted, thanking him for giving her family a gift beyond price, the knowledge that Harold had known and had cared and had fought to save his loved ones, even though fate or physics or the fixed nature of past events had prevented him from succeeding. After meeting Margaret and delivering Harold's message, Marcus expected to feel closure, to be released from the obsession that had consumed him for over a year since his first encounter with the impossible gas station. Instead, he found himself more deeply entangled in questions about temporal anomalies and the nature of time itself. His curiosity intensified rather than satisfied by the confirmation that his experiences were real enough to affect living people and family histories. He continued researching reports of similar phenomena along Interstate 15 and other desert highways, cataloging patterns and commonalities that suggested these temporal slips followed rules, even if humans didn't yet understand what those rules were. Marcus discovered that October seemed to be a particularly active month for temporal anomalies across multiple locations, with reports clustering around dates that coincided with tragic events or significant anniversaries. He found accounts from other drivers who'd encountered businesses that shouldn't exist, vehicles from wrong eras sharing the highway, and even other people who claimed to have briefly accessed different time periods before returning to their proper timeline with only memories and occasionally physical evidence to prove their experiences hadn't been hallucinations or dreams. The sheer volume of similar reports from independent sources suggested that something genuine was occurring, even if mainstream science refused to acknowledge phenomena that didn't fit conventional understanding of causality and temporal mechanics. He also noticed geographic patterns, discovering that temporal anomalies seem more common in desert regions and other isolated landscapes where human activity was minimal and the Earth's surface remained largely unchanged across decades or centuries. Places where the view in one direction might look almost identical, whether you were observing it in 1963 or 2025, where the absence of development meant fewer visual markers distinguishing one era from another. Perhaps in such locations, the boundaries between different moments became more permeable, easier for consciousness or matter to slip through when conditions aligned properly, when anniversary dates resonated with the original events, when observers approached with the right mixture of need and openness to impossible experiences. Marcus began keeping a detailed journal of his experiences and observations, documenting his encounters with Harold Mitchell and recording every detail he could remember about the gas station's appearance, the interaction, and the conditions that had preceded his ability to access 1963. He hoped that by creating a thorough record, he might help future researchers understand these phenomena better, might contribute to eventual scientific investigation of temporal anomalies, even if current mainstream institutions dismissed such things as impossible or delusional. Someone needed to preserve these accounts, to treat them as potentially valuable data, rather than as mere entertainment or cautionary tales about the dangers of isolation and fatigue. His employer grew concerned about Marcus's continued fascination with what they viewed as an unhealthy obsession, worried that his focus on paranormal research might compromise his driving safety or judgment. They mandated counseling sessions with a company psychologist who specialized in helping drivers cope with the isolation and stress of long-haul trucking, concerned that Marcus might be experiencing a breakdown that could endanger himself and others on the road. Marcus attended the sessions dutifully, but found himself unable to share the full truth of his experiences, knowing that admitting to interactions with temporal ghosts would likely result in medical leave or termination rather than understanding and support. During one session, The psychologist suggested that Marcus might be experiencing a form of dissociation triggered by the repetitive nature of long-haul trucking, where the mind creates elaborate fantasies to cope with monotony and isolation, projecting meaning onto random sensory input and constructing narratives that feel profoundly significant but are actually just psychological defense mechanisms against the grinding loneliness of the road. Marcus listened politely and agreed to consider this interpretation, but privately he knew that no psychological theory could explain the physical receipt with its impossible date. The confirmed details about Harold Mitchell that Marcus had no way of knowing before his encounters, or the profound impact his story had on Margaret Sullivan when he delivered Harold's message to her. He continued driving Interstate 15 regularly, passing the empty lot where Mitchell's gas station had stood decades ago, occasionally stopping to sit in the darkness and watch for any signs of temporal anomalies manifesting again. Most nights brought nothing but desert silence and distant traffic sounds, the empty lot remaining stubbornly normal and rooted firmly in 2025. But Marcus remained patient, understanding now that these phenomena operated on schedules beyond human control, that forcing or demanding access to other timelines was futile, that observers could only position themselves hopefully and wait for conditions to align in ways that permitted brief glimpses across temporal boundaries. On October 12th of the following year, Marcus returned once again to the site, his third annual pilgrimage to the location where his understanding of reality had been permanently altered. This time, he brought a better camera, audio recording equipment, and instruments for measuring electromagnetic fields and temperature variations, hoping to capture more than just his own subjective observations if the phenomenon manifested again. As darkness fell and the anniversary hour approached, Marcus sat in his truck surrounded by his equipment, feeling simultaneously foolish for believing lightning might strike 3 times and hopeful that the universe would grant him another glimpse behind the veil that separated different moments. Nothing happened for hours, the equipment showing only normal readings, the empty lot remaining dark and abandoned, and Marcus began accepting that perhaps his 2 previous encounters had exhausted whatever mechanism allowed access to Harold Mitchell's trapped moment. But just as he was preparing to give up for another year, his electromagnetic field detector suddenly spiked to levels far higher than any natural phenomenon could explain, and in his side mirror, lights began to glow where the empty lot stood, outlining familiar shapes that Marcus had seen twice before but never stopped yearning to encounter again. This time Marcus was prepared, his camera recording the mirror's reflection, even though he knew from previous experience that it probably wouldn't capture what his eyes could see, his audio equipment running in case Harold's voice somehow became audible across the temporal barrier. The gas station materialized in the mirror's reflection exactly as it had appeared during his previous encounters, pristine and impossibly bright, with Harold Mitchell emerging from the building to stand under the lights and look toward where Marcus's truck existed in a different timeline. The man raised his hand in greeting, and Marcus saw recognition in his posture, an acknowledgement that they'd done this before, that they were trapped together in some kind of loop where past and present touched briefly on anniversary dates. Marcus grabbed his notebook and wrote quickly, "I delivered your message. Your wife's family knows you tried to save them." Harold's reflected image seemed to relax visibly, his shoulders dropping as if a weight had been lifted, and he wrote his own response. "Thank you. That means everything." The exchange was simple but profound, a completion of the task that had brought them together across impossible distances of time, a closing of the circle that had begun with Marcus stopping for fuel at a station that shouldn't exist. Marcus felt tears on his face again, moved by the knowledge that even trapped in eternal repetition, Harold could find peace in knowing that his struggle had been witnessed and communicated to people who cared. Harold wrote another message, his handwriting more urgent now. "You're not stuck like me. You can still choose. Don't waste your time chasing ghosts. Live your life." Marcus stared at these words, understanding that Harold was offering wisdom earned through decades of experiencing the same moments repeatedly, watching the world move forward while he remained frozen at the instant before tragedy. The man who couldn't change his own fate was urging Marcus to exercise the freedom that Harold no longer possessed, to make choices and live fully, rather than becoming obsessed with mysteries that couldn't be fully solved or understood. Marcus wrote his response through tears. "What if I can find a way to free you? What if I can break the loop?" Harold's reflected image shook his head slowly, his expression mixing sadness with acceptance, and he wrote, "Some things can't be changed. Some moments are fixed. My place is here, repeating this night forever. But you have a future. Don't sacrifice it for a past that's already written." The wisdom in these words hit Marcus like a physical blow. The realization that his obsession with understanding temporal anomalies had consumed years of his life that could have been spent living rather than investigating, creating new experiences rather than fixating on impossible ones. They communicated for another hour, Marcus asking questions about what it felt like to exist in a temporal loop, whether Harold experienced boredom or despair, or whether the repetition somehow made each cycle feel fresh and immediate. Harold described his existence as like being an actor, performing the same play forever, going through familiar motions while retaining memory of all previous performances, watching for subtle variations that never came, because the script was fixed and couldn't be altered regardless of how much he wanted to improvise different outcomes. He said the worst part wasn't the repetition itself, but the knowledge that just beyond his reach existed a future he would never access, a life he would never live, grandchildren he would never meet, because his timeline had been cut short and frozen at the moment before tragedy. As their communication continued, Marcus's recording equipment captured only static and his own voice, reading aloud what Harold was writing. No visual evidence of the gas station appearing in his mirror's reflection. No electromagnetic signatures that would convince skeptics that something impossible was occurring. Marcus realized that these encounters existed in a space beyond scientific verification, accessible only to those who experienced them directly, forever unprovable to anyone who demanded objective evidence before accepting extraordinary claims. Perhaps that was part of the phenomenon's nature, that it revealed itself only to individuals rather than allowing collective observation that might force mainstream science to revise its understanding of temporal mechanics. Finally, as the anniversary hour passed and dawn began approaching, Harold wrote his farewell message. "Thank you for seeing me, for remembering me, for telling my family. I tried. You've given my existence meaning beyond just endless repetition. Now go live your life, make choices, create a future. Don't become a ghost like me, trapped in one moment you can't escape." Marcus nodded and wrote his own goodbye. "I'll remember you. I'll tell your story. I'll honor your sacrifice. Thank you for showing me that time isn't what I thought it was." Harold smiled in the mirror's reflection, raised his hand in final salute, and then faded as the gas station's lights dimmed and disappeared, leaving Marcus alone with the empty lot and the approaching dawn. Marcus sat in his truck as the sun rose, watching the desert landscape transform from darkness to brilliant color under the morning light, feeling changed in ways he couldn't fully articulate but knew were permanent and profound. He'd glimpsed behind reality's curtain, had seen evidence that time wasn't the simple, forward-flowing river everyone assumed, but rather something more complex and mysterious, full of loops and eddies and strange connections between moments that should have remained forever separated. But he'd also received wisdom from someone trapped by that complexity, had been urged to embrace the freedom of living in linear time rather than becoming paralyzed by knowledge of temporal anomalies that couldn't be controlled or fully understood. He made a decision then, sitting in his truck beside the empty lot as the October morning grew warmer around him. He would keep the receipt, would preserve his documentation of these encounters, would share his story with anyone willing to listen, But he wouldn't let obsession with the impossible consume the rest of his life, wouldn't sacrifice years chasing after phenomena that revealed themselves according to their own schedules rather than human demands. Harold Mitchell had given him a gift beyond the temporal encounter itself, the wisdom to recognize that some mysteries were meant to be witnessed and honored rather than solved and controlled, that life's value lay in the choices free individuals could make rather than in understanding every paradox existence offered. Years passed after that final encounter with Harold Mitchell, and Marcus continued driving Interstate 15 through the Nevada desert, always glancing at the empty lot where the gas station had stood, but no longer stopping every time, no longer expecting the phenomenon to manifest on demand. He told his story to other drivers who would listen, finding that some had their own encounters with the impossible to share, creating an informal network of people who'd glimpsed beyond conventional reality and had chosen to integrate those experiences into their lives rather than let them become consuming obsessions. He married, had children, eventually retired from trucking after 35 years behind the wheel. All the normal milestones of human life that Harold Mitchell had been denied when fire took his future and trapped him in endless repetition. On October 12th of each year, Marcus would drive to Nevada if circumstances permitted, would sit beside the empty lot for a few hours, watching the darkness and honoring the memory of a man who died decades ago, but whose consciousness apparently remained accessible under the right conditions on anniversary dates. Sometimes he thought he saw flickers of light in his mirrors, brief hints that the phenomenon still occurred, even if he could no longer fully access it, that Harold Mitchell continued his eternal repetition somewhere in the space between moments, forever serving travelers in a gas station that existed only in a frozen instant of time. Marcus would raise his hand in salute to that possibility, offering respect to a ghost or memory or whatever label applied to consciousness trapped in temporal loops. The receipt remained in Marcus's wallet for years, yellowing further but never completely deteriorating, a physical anchor to impossible experiences that had changed his understanding of reality forever. He eventually donated it to a paranormal research organization, along with his complete documentation of the encounters, hoping that future investigators might find useful patterns in his records, even if current science couldn't explain or verify what he'd experienced. He told his children and grandchildren the story as they grew old enough to appreciate it, sharing Harold Mitchell's wisdom about living fully rather than becoming trapped in single moments, using his impossible encounters as foundation for teaching about the importance of making choices and creating futures, rather than fixating on past mysteries that couldn't be changed. In his final years, Marcus sometimes wondered if he too would end up trapped in some temporal loop after death, if consciousness that had glimpsed the malleability of time might be more susceptible to becoming caught in repetitive moments like Harold Mitchell had been. But mostly he felt grateful for the life he'd lived, the choices he'd made, the family he'd created, all the things that Harold had been denied when tragedy froze him in place on October 12, 1963. Marcus died peacefully at age 78, surrounded by loved ones, having lived a full life that honored the warning he'd received from a ghost, trapped in an abandoned gas station that somehow continued existing in a moment that shouldn't still be accessible, but apparently was. And on Interstate 15 in the Nevada desert, the empty lot where Harold Mitchell's gas station once stood remains visible to travelers passing between Las Vegas and Los Angeles, looking like nothing more than another abandoned business that failed to survive the harsh economics of desert commerce. But on October 12th of certain years, if conditions align properly and observers approach with the right mixture of need and openness to impossible experiences, lights reportedly still appear where the station once stood, and a friendly attendant in white uniform still emerges to serve travelers whose vehicles bridge somehow the gap between present and past, offering fuel at 1963 prices and handwritten receipts dated decades before their customers were born, forever trapped in The last normal night before tragedy transformed a thriving business into legend and mystery, and a cautionary tale about the nature of time in the vast emptiness of the American desert.